He was flawless, brilliant, radiant. But something in that radiance shifted. The light did exactly what it was meant to do. It reflected, and the reflection began to see itself. He stood closest to the source, the first to receive, the most precise expression of order. But perfection carries weight, and weight distorts. He wanted his own theatre, a place to shine without a throne above him, a kingdom lit by his own brilliance. This story begins before rebellion, before consequence, before death. This is where creation reached too far. If you too want a kingdom lit by your own brilliance, check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legends, and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. Let the show begin. Halel ben Sakar, the Shining One, Son of the Dawn. One name, one moment of poetry that fractures into centuries of theology, speculation, and fear. On the surface, it's a taunt, a sharp, mocking rebuke aimed at a Babylonian king whose arrogance reached divine heights. He exalted himself like a god, built empires like ziggurats, reached for the heavens, and like Babel, he fell. That's the literal layer. That's what the text says. But something else lives underneath it. This is myth in camouflage. The language cracks open, and something ancient breathes beneath the surface. The tone shifts. It stops sounding like mockery and starts sounding like memory. The name, Halel ben Sakar, doesn't translate cleanly. Shining One is close, but it misses the weight, the oomph. This is celestial light, the kind that appears before the sun, that burns as announcement. The Greeks had phosphorus, the Romans called it Lucifer, lightbringer, the one who rises before the day, the one who leads the sun. That's what entered the Latin Vulgate, the official translation of the Bible into Latin, completed by Jerome in the 4th century. It became the dominant version of Scripture used by the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. When Jerome came to Isaiah 14:12, he translated Halel ben Sakar as Lucifer, capitalized, one word, elevated to a proper name, and from there the fracture deepened. The title became the name, the metaphor became a myth, and the myth hardened into doctrine. But let's pause here, because this is the paradox. How does the lightbringer become the adversary? How does a figure of illumination become the one we associate with exile, deception, and downfall? The fall was pulled into the story. Over centuries, line by line, sermon by sermon, this figure was dragged backwards through the text until he reached Eden, and then backwards still until he stood in heaven as perfection, the one who burned the brightest. And now this single verse carries the weight of an entire theology. Halel, the Shining One, became Lucifer, the Fallen One. And with that fall came a question that has never stopped. What if the greatest fall didn't come from evil, but from too much light? Ezekiel 28, the Old Testament. Ezekiel was a priest turned prophet during the Babylonian exile. His visions are strange, vivid, and sometimes disturbing, and in chapter 28 he delivers a judgment against the king of Tyre, a Phoenician port city known for its wealth, pride, and power. The voice here, understood as the voice of God, is speaking through Ezekiel. The target is a mortal king, a ruler bloated with self-worship, seated high in a city of gold and trade, a man who called himself a god while sitting in the seat of men. But partway through the passage, something shifts. The voice, still divine, starts describing someone too vast, too radiant, too ancient to be human. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Kings aren't described in this way. This is something else. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Now we're no longer in Tyre. We've moved upstream, back to the root, to Eden. Every precious stone was your covering. You were the anointed cherub who covers. You were on the holy mountain of God. A throne guardian, a celestial being, one placed into position, the anointed cherub covered in light, commissioned to stand beside the divine, beside the source. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, until unrighteousness was found in you. That line cracks like thunder. From the day you were created. This being didn't rise through the ranks. He was installed, elevated, blameless, complete. Until. That word carries the entire weight of the fall. The sudden appearance of something unaccounted for within a flawless design. The psychological tension here is unbearable. A being built to perfection collapses from within. The architecture of the order caves in on itself. The flaw, it wasn't taught, it emerged. Which raised the question no theology wants to face. What happened when the system produces its own contradiction? Was this being created with the possibility of collapse? Or was the collapse the result of perfection functioning to its limit? He was placed in Eden, wrapped in beauty, anointed for proximity, and still he fell. Can one be too perfect? There is a fall, we imagine, violent, decisive, cast in fire and thunder. The moment heaven fractures and a traitor is hurled from the heights, the rebellion, the casting down. But that image, as vivid as it is, doesn't come from Scripture, not directly. It comes from a long, slow process of reconstruction, a need to explain the unexplainable, a response to the riddle left behind by Isaiah and Ezekiel. The book of Revelation, often pointed to as a record of this revolt, was never written as history, but a vision, a dream, prophecy shaped by trauma. John of Patmos, writing in exile during Roman persecution, described symbols rather than scenes. A woman clothed in the sun, a beast from the sea, and a dragon, vast, red, crowned, and enraged. Revelation 12 describes this dragon warring in heaven, opposed by Michael and his angels. It loses. It is thrown down, and the text names this creature that ancient serpent, the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. This is the moment that many have used to map Lucifer's descent, but there's no mention of him in the passage, no mention of a lightbringer or a radiant cherub, and yet, over time, the boundaries between these stories dissolved. The dragon of Revelation was fused with the figure we met earlier because the myth could no longer stand without it. We were missing a cause, a story, a rebellion. So we built one. In texts that fell outside the official canon, the cracks begin to widen. In the life of Adam and Eve, a being refuses to bow before humanity and is punished for his pride. In the book of Enoch, angels descend, disrupt, and are cast into darkness. Fragments, strange, varied, contradictory, but they echo pattern. Divine proximity followed by self-will, which becomes a sin through comparison. The idea begins to form. Something too close to God saw itself and recoiled. By the time we reach the early church fathers, the narrative has begun to crystallize. Commentaries on Ezekiel and Isaiah reframe the old verses as allegories. Lucifer becomes the proud angel, Satan becomes his title, and the fall becomes a consequence. What was once a loose association is official language. The dragon is the devil, the shining one is the enemy, and the enemy is given a motive: rebellion. Then comes Milton. In 1667, John Milton publishes Paradise Lost, an epic poem that finishes the tradition. He writes the story as if it had always been there. He gives the angel words, dignity, fury. He gives him hell, but as a throne. He gives him a voice that sounds like freedom and pride and pain. Milton, he gives him a face. The transformation happens through accumulation, through centuries of sermons, commentary, poetry, and doctrine. The story is stitched together from longing and fear, the need to make sense of fall without reason, the need to name the fracture, the need to punish it so that the radiant one, the guardian of perfection, becomes something else, the deceiver. And by the time we meet him in Revelation, the myth has already won. He has already become Satan. We couldn't accept that light could fall without someone to blame. Pride. We're told the fall began with pride. The angel saw himself and elevated his heart. He desired the throne, and for that he fell. Pride, the first sin, the origin point of rebellion. But pride is a label. It describes the consequence, not the cause. If we look closer, what we find beneath that label is something older: awareness. Before rebellion, there was perception, a moment of self-recognition. A being so saturated in brilliance becomes aware of its own alignment. The light, which once passed through it freely, begins to loop, to reflect. That reflection becomes a mirror, and the mirror, it begins to question. What happens when a created being sees itself as a self rather than a cog? What happens when obedience becomes identity? What happens when the servant begins to understand that it is serving? The moment of I am, I will ascend, I will rule, comes later. This begins with something quieter, the first flicker of separation from the role, a distinction between what one is and what one was made to do. In theology, this is often collapsed into pride. But pride is only the surface, the visible tip of something far deeper, the first choice. To observe, measure, to compare, to turn the gaze inward, even for a moment, and see something other than the Creator. Perfection, by definition, contains no awareness of imperfection, but consciousness introduces possibility. The lightbringer begins to question where the light ends and where he begins. He stood closest, the most saturated, the most aligned, which may have made the distinction harder to hold. Could the light have been coming from above? Or was it now originating from within? Who held the authority? The fall, then, begins with a question that could not be asked without awareness. Then freedom follows because it becomes inescapable. The will awakens, and what follows, the pride, the ascent, the war, is aftermath. Pride was the smoke. Consciousness was the spark. The angels that remain aligned obey without interpretation. Their function is inseparable from their nature. But Lucifer sees, he becomes like us. To be human is to carry the unbearable burden of self-awareness, of knowing that we are performing a role while also questioning it. The ache between what we are and what we were told to be begins with him. The first to feel the strain, the first to ask if the position he held was the same as the self he was. The first to want something that wasn't given. It is the story of individuation. The moment a mind steps outside of its designed orbit and asks what it means to exist apart from command. Lucifer becomes the prototype of agency. This is why he recurs across cultures. The name may be different, but the pattern remains. In Gnostic texts, he is the liberator. The serpent in Eden reveals. He makes Eve aware of her nakedness, her vulnerability, yes, but also her difference, her selfhood, her capacity to choose. He gives knowledge, and for that he is punished. God, no longer the benevolent creator. He is the demiurge, a blind artificer, mistaking himself for the source. He bars humanity from the truth, and the rebel is the one who breaks the seal. He is hated because he tells the truth too soon. He ruptures the illusion of paradise by letting us see it clearly. Lucifer becomes Prometheus, chained to the rock for gifting fire, the tool that elevates humanity beyond animal instinct. He becomes Enki, the Sumerian god who saves humans from the flood in defiance of divine decree. He becomes the bearer of forbidden tools, the one who crosses the line then pays the price. In every tradition, the bringer of knowledge is punished. Knowledge is dangerous. It fractures the world. It replaces harmony with choice, function and freedom, safety with ambiguity. The law is broken the moment you become capable of seeing it from the outside. To know is to fall, Eden undone by perception. The instant humanity sees itself as separate, paradise becomes impossible. The moment we understand the walls, we are already outside them, and the gates close behind us. That is the cost of knowing, the nature of exile, inevitability. You can't serve once your eyes are open, and you cannot return to innocence once knowledge has burned a hole in it. Lucifer is the first to face that, a being who wanted to understand rather than obey, who turned the light inward and asked what it meant to be, but is still with us. In every figure who questions, in every myth that whispers of a forbidden truth, he walks through scripture, yes, but he also appears in philosophy, in literature, in grief. Wherever there is an ache of becoming, the fracture of consciousness, the demand to know what lies beyond the veil, he's present. He is the part of us that asks why. He isn't the opposite of humanity. He is the origin point. He is the most human of all beings. I titled this video's God Perfect Mistake. But what if there was no mistake? What does it mean when a being created for perfection unravels from within? If God is omniscient, then this wasn't a surprise. Lucifer fell by doing exactly what he was made to do. He saw, he discerned, he asked, and the heavens fractured. The horror lies in the possibility that God built a structure knowing it would collapse. That collapse wasn't failure, it was function. He isn't the flaw. He's the part of the system that brings the flaw into view. The fall introduces contrast. It makes choice visible. God permits it. He allows the contradictions under which freedom appears, and then condemns the first to move. Here, theology trembles, because if God is all-knowing, then rebellion was part of the original script. The war was never a threat. The exile was foreseen. The throne was never at risk. Lucifer wasn't a rival. He was a catalyst. A perfect creation falling questions the design, unless that was the design. Unless obedience only matters when it can be broken. Unless love only means something beside the possibility of rejection. Lucifer's act is cast as evil, but it's the only event that makes good intelligible. God remains unchallenged, but the structure begins to show its shape, a hierarchy built by exclusion. Lucifer falls, and in falling he reveals what can't be said. That knowledge is a violation. That order requires rebellion, that freedom only becomes real when fracture enters. If that's true, then Lucifer didn't defy the plan. He completed it.